Hello and welcome to a special edition of Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And in this special episode, we are joined by a special guest, the historian and science writer, Stephen Johnson. Stephen, welcome to Journey Through Time.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
For those who don't know your work, Stephen, I will summarize your long and illustrious career. You are the author of, is it 14 books at the moment, or have I missed one?
No, that's the count. 14
at the moment, including my favorite, if I may say so, Ghost Map, which is a brilliant account of how kind of lateral thinking and cartography and individual personalities came together to crack the code of the cause of cholera and the great epidemics of mid-Victorian London. But among your other books are Where Good Ideas Come From, Farsighted, and The Infernal Machine. That's the most recent, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
You've been working also as editorial director at Google Labs, where you're one of the co-founders of Notebook LM, a new research and writing tool that's powered by AI. And that's the subject of this special episode of Journey Through Time, the history of AI, an idea that's exploded into our world in a way that just a few years ago seemed implausible. I wonder if we can go back to one of the founders of the concept behind AI, a figure that British audiences will very likely be familiar with, Alan Turing.
Yeah, I mean, I think Turing is a fantastic place to start, in a sense, in his kind of tragically brief career, thinking about what would become artificial intelligence. He kind of embodies two or three of the kind of core themes that develop over the rest of the history. The most familiar one is the connection between AI and computers in general and World War II. And basically fighting the kind of the war effort during the 40s, particularly with code breaking, right? If you've ever seen the movie, The Imitation Game, you will know some of this story that in cracking the code of the German Enigma device, a whole host of ideas about what computers were capable of doing, their ability to, in a sense, like find meaning in seemingly meaningless information, right? Finding the secret code, in a sense, a kind of language in the German communications. That was one of the first times that a machine had been assigned to that kind of task and successfully done it. And Turing was kind of the key visionary behind that.
And this was the work that was done in the famous Bletchley Park, the code breakers. Turing was one of the figures, this kind of collection of geniuses brought together to try to find a way of hacking into the German ciphers.
Yeah, there are these wonderful places, physical places that are associated with this stage in the history of computers. One of them is Bletchley Park. The other is Bell Labs in the United States. And they're filled with these kind of oddballs and mavericks and folks who have a vision for what machines can do in terms of thinking that, it's so far ahead of their particular moment in time. And there's something about putting all those people, like putting them into an old kind of decaying mansion and just having them be in the same physical space with each other that creates all these kind of sparks of ideas that lead to what, arguably the most important two revolutions really of the last 70 or 80 years, computers in the first place and now artificial intelligence.
One of the great contributions that Turing made to this history that leads to artificial intelligence took place after the war. And it's an academic paper. And it's one of those seminal foundational academic papers that asks the really big question. Computing, Machinery and Intelligence was the title of the paper. It was in a journal called Mind. And it asked that really big question. Can machines think? Will they ever be able to think?
Yeah, there's so many things in this paper. I mean, you could teach 2 semesters just on what went into it and what came out of it, in a sense. He has a couple of different speculations. So one of the core things that we'll talk about over this whole conversation, which is another reason why Turing is so important and such a great place to start, is in addition to the connection between the war and artificial intelligence, there's maybe a more surprising connection between games and artificial intelligence. And if you look at the long arc of how AI developed, almost at every turn, someone is using games as a way to advance the technology. And why that is a really interesting thing. We can get into it. But for Turing, it began with chess. And so he'd come out of the Enigma project and was starting to speculate, kind of meditate on this idea of could a computer or could a machine be really designed in such a way so that you could say that it was thinking and that it was intelligent in the way that we think about humans as being intelligent. And the first thing that kind of pops into his mind, in part because of his background and his interest in the game, is he thinks, like, could you teach a computer to play a game of chess? And he has a line in it where he's like, yeah, you could probably teach it to play chess, poorly. Like it could play a rather bad game is, I think, the language that he uses. But he has this idea of like, maybe there's a mechanism for self-improvement. If you could start with a very bad chess player, but get feedback from playing games and slowly understanding the rules and the strategies of chess from those multiple interactions, maybe something like a higher level form of chess expertise could be developed. And so from the very beginning, there's this connection between thinking and playing that is absolutely at the center of the history of this technology.
Turing today, he's remembered as one of the fathers of the theory behind computers. And theory is a really important word here, because he is making these big speculations about what computers will or will not be able to do in the future at a time when computer technology is beyond basic. I mean, these are laughably rudimentary machines by modern standards.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was all extremely speculative. And there's a whole alternate history, that Ian McEwan wrote a wonderful book that kind of touched on this, where Turing ends up dying tragically, we believe, committing suicide after a whole host of terrible kind of homophobic interventions from the state. He's dead by the middle of the 1950s. And so all this stuff that he's starting to think about, like the alternate history where Turing lives and, lives into the 80s and is able to like push this technology along. I mean, the work that he was able to do in just 3 or 4 years after the war was extraordinary and had a transformative effect on the field. But if he had lived longer, that history might have been very different.
In this paper, Turing asks another question, and it's a question that in the past 2.5 years, has been debated more than ever, which is what we now call the Turing Test.
He was trying to figure out how you would be able to tell that a computer was properly thinking. Like, what would be the measurement you would use? We now have a whole host of kind of benchmarks of intelligence that we use when the new AI model comes out and we run these benchmarks. But this was a new field. No one had ever thought about this before. This was, there's no mechanical calculators, never had a test to see, like, is this mechanical calculator thinking or not? Because that would have been a crazy question. But Turing, as usual, was multiple steps ahead of everyone else. And so in trying to answer this question, really as a thought experiment, like how would you be able to tell if a machine was truly intelligent? He came up with this idea of the Turing test. And the Turing test was basically you had a human being in conversation with another entity via what we would now call text chat. I mean, they didn't have the idea of a text chat back then, but in other words, you were not hearing the voice. You were not seeing the physical entity that you were in conversation with. You were just getting a series of words from them.
So there was no visual cues, nothing to give away anything about this entity.
No audio cues either. And you would just have a conversation, and sometimes in this experiment, there would be a computer on the other side of the wall, in a sense, and sometimes there would be a human. And the idea was, if you had an extended conversation, unscripted, just like the conversation we're having right now, and if I couldn't tell whether you were a human or whether you were a machine, that was probably a sign that something significant had happened, and the entity on the other side, the machine on the other side of the wall, was actually capable of thinking, was actually capable of being intelligent. As we'll see, like, this seemed in, the early 1950s, like, one, a very unlikely thing that a machine would ever be able to do that. And two, it seemed like, well, that would clearly be a validation of the machine being intelligent were it able to do that. As we'll see, we now live in a world where actually computers can pass the Turing test. And now we've kind of changed the standards a little bit. And there's an argument people are making saying that, weirdly, that the Turing test was too easy, and that it isn't, in fact, a valid assessment of intelligence. But we can get to that when we get further along in the story.
Can I just come in there? I need to position myself in this conversation as somebody who knows almost nothing about AI or the history of computer science, but coming at it from my, kind of humanities-based background. And I know we're going to get into this later, but it's something that people are talking about a lot already. And so it seems to me that it's worth asking the question is that, of course, part of what all of this begs from the start is a definition of intelligence, right? How do we know what intelligence is? And what you're describing is a process of total inference. All we can do is infer intelligence from language or from modeling or from something, but that I mean, I'm reminded of when IQ tests were introduced in 1923, and the great American critic Walter Lippmann said, you cannot measure what has not been defined, and you haven't defined intelligence, therefore you cannot measure it. And he saw that the instant that they started talking about IQ, right? And it seems to me that when we talk about, I'm sure people have been talking about this forever with Turing, right? But it does raise that fundamental question, right? It's we kind of all talk about AI and we glibly ask questions about, is it intelligent? Is it not intelligent? But we never stop and say, well, but we don't actually know what intelligence is, do we? Do we? Can you tell me what intelligence is? Has that been cracked? And I missed it. It's possible.
I mean, it's such a good point, Sarah. I think that like so many of these issues that are happening right now, there's a whole host of kind of questions, like philosophical questions, practical questions about how we define these things. What does it mean to understand something? What does it mean to problem solve? What is creativity? All these things. What has happened in the last few years with AI, regardless of how you think about how significant it is, there's a whole new set of experiments that we can now run, new questions that can now be asked because we have this kind of alternate way of thinking that has emerged. And I think it's just forcing us to revisit all these things. So one example of intelligence that, that Turing used is, that I think is really interesting, is that one sign of an intelligent machine he thought would be the ability to make an analogy, that kind of creative ability to be like, this thing, which is different from this other thing, is nonetheless like this thing. And that so much of, human intelligence is that ability to see patterns and see connections that aren't literal. You can say that a computer is like a chess player, but they're obviously very different on some level. But an intelligent person can see this kind of semantic or causal connections between those two things and build that analogy. Early on, like Turing was thinking like, well, if you could do that kind of conceptual thinking, then in the form of a machine, that would be a major advance as well.
It's interesting now to jump ahead for a moment to where we are now. The test that follows Turing's test is not to use it to define whether a computer is intelligent. It's what does it mean for the individual who's just had that conversation and is incapable of telling whether they've spoken to a human being or a machine. What does it mean for the society in which that individual is in? And because this was so theoretical and speculative, as you said, Stephen, those other questions that we are very live today, Turing didn't spend much time debating those questions because he knew the computer technology was so far away.
Yeah, and we now since then have learned that people are very susceptible to seeing human-like intelligence, even in places where it's not. I mean, there's a famous experiment in the 60s called ELIZA, where someone built a very simple program that was modeled after a certain kind of psychotherapy, where the analyst would basically just respond to you by taking your comments and just rephrasing them as a question. And so you would say I had a very disturbing dream last night about my parents. And then the computer would say, why do you think you had that dream? And it was just a very simple script, take the text that the person has said and turn it into a question. And there was absolutely no intelligence there.
Keep asking why.
And keep asking why, basically. Yeah.
But it didn't charge you $200 at the end of the session. That's the difference.
People were convinced that there was some kind of intelligence there. So there's a level of projection that does happen here, that we want to see intelligence when we hear, particularly when there's language involved. There's up until recent years, the only entities that had mastered language in any form were humans who are intelligent. And so there's such a deep connection between the ability to put a sentence together and intelligence that when we see a computer do it, there's a feeling it must be smart.
Isn't it also the case, though, that in the example that you just gave with ELIZA all the way up to now, but it's also the case that programmers are working to create language patterns, as in the example that you just gave, that mimic human behavior. I mean, so there is a human intervention there that is encouraged. So it's not just that we are projecting onto the machine human emotions. It's that the programmers are making it sound like it has human emotions, right?
That is, as we will see when we get to it, that is the way it works. Until very recently. The programmers would sit there and be like, this is what the structure of a sentence is. Here are the words. If the user says X, use these words in response. If the user says Y, use these words in response. This is what syntax is like. They had to formally specify all that. And what's changed in the last 5 years is that the computers are able to kind of, in a sense, learn that language structure on their own independently. And that is what has everyone kind of both dazzled and concerned.
So I'm anticipating. Sorry, we'll get there.
Before we get to that period, sometimes called the machine learning period, I think it's important to say that this is one of those stories of innovation, and you write a lot about innovation, Stephen, that is not a clear trajectory. It's not an upward curve from Turing's speculations and questions in the 1950s to where we are now. This is a story full of peaks and troughs and what are sometimes called AI winters.
There's a period of sudden acceleration conceptually, which is basically what we've been describing in the 50s. The term artificial intelligence is coined in the 50s. And there are these hotbeds of it at Bell Labs and at Stanford where folks are kind of advancing the field. And everybody's very excited. There's an early version of machine learning, of neural nets, as we would call them, called the perceptron, that comes out in 1958. And there's an amazing article that was in the New Yorker, the New York Times, where the creator of this thing is interviewed. And it basically is just a simple shape recognizer, but it kind of could independently learn, just as we were talking about, Sarah, it could learn how to recognize those shapes without being taught what the shapes were. And in this interview, the guy says, it's still very rudimentary, but you could see a path to actually having it turn into a universal translation machine for all human languages. There's just a couple of steps between what I built and that. And it was like the steps took 50 years. Just a couple of little steps here. So there was this long period where the field just didn't seem to advance as fast as its early advocates thought.
And there was always those moments when those early advocates kind of oversold.
Yeah.
If you look back at the history, you look at those interviews, wonderful black and white interviews in men in 1950s and 1960s suits. And they tend to be saying, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, within one generation. There is a story of overselling and overhyping AI, which didn't do the field very much good in the end.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we still have that legacy a little bit. And I think I certainly felt that a little bit when these first kind of breakthroughs started happening 3 or 4 years ago, where there was a bit of a sense when some of us were saying, hey, this feels like the real deal. Like this is like the thing that Turing was anticipating is finally happening. And I think because of the AI winter and because of, generations of hype and, the future is just 5 years away, there was some skepticism in the beginning that maybe is disappearing as people spend more time with these machines.
It was always over the horizon, this new threshold. These machines were suddenly going to break through, and it didn't happen. And I guess the AI winter, which is the sort of 60s and 70s, I mean, it's a winter because the people who fund these experiments and fund these departments in universities kind of got a bit sick of the overhyping and the funding evaporated. Yeah,
it was a feeling of, we've come up with some strategies here that we think will lead us to something like artificial intelligence, but they're not paying dividends. And maybe that means we have the wrong strategies. There's just kind of doubt about how you would get there and whether this kind of approach, as you said, of machine learning and neural nets was really the right way to do it. And in a way, that period is the advances are all starting to happen in like science fiction, right? You have like HAL in 2001 and, these other kind of iconic AI figures coming out of science fiction that end up being relevant in helping us think through what we should do once we do have intelligent machines. In a way, it's fiction that's driving the thinking during the 60s and early 70s. And what ends up getting us out of the winter, in a way, appropriately enough, given Turing's original obsession, is games. We come back to games and chess specifically.
I love this story, and I love it because I vaguely remember it. And it makes me realize all this was happening. I was getting on with being a kid, and these amazing things were happening. But this was a moment that everybody saw because it was astonishing. This is a moment in the mid-90s where IBM have invented a new AI piece of hardware, a computer called Deep Blue, and they set it against the greatest chess player of his age, arguably one of the greatest chess players of all time.
Yeah, Garry Kasparov. And Kasparov he is to this day very interested in AI. He's actually has become an advocate for AI, even though he was kind of dethroned by it. But he had played and been involved with these kind of matches, and he had generally kind of won them against computers. But IBM had built this dedicated machine. And I think it's really important to point out two things about this machine. Like, all it could do was play chess. This is not a general intelligence machine. If you asked it to help you write an essay, it was useless for it. It was dedicated to chess. And also, and this is really important because we changed the approach down the line, it was based on a dedicated history of human chess expertise. And so it basically had this kind of encyclopedia of all the great chess moves that had ever been made. And it was just basically faster at looking up the right move and kind of calculating the possibilities of various moves. But its intelligence was kind of learned from human expertise over the centuries of humans playing chess. But nonetheless, in 1997, Deep Blue defeats Kasparov. And that is this kind of iconic moment in the history of the connection between humans and machines, in the sense of like chess is, we think of it as this, kind of high watermark of human intelligence. Very smart people are very good at chess. It actually turns out to be maybe less of a useful yardstick, because the kinds of things that are required to win at chess are actually pretty well modeled by computers. And there's a classic line from Noam Chomsky, who to this day is very skeptical about AI. But he argued that Deep Blue's victory was about as interesting as a bulldozer winning the Olympics for weightlifting, which I thought was great. Like, yeah, of course, a machine, if you spend all your money just making that machine good at chess and nothing else, and all it has to do is just sit around all day thinking about chess, it's eventually going to beat a human. That's not surprising. What would be interesting if the computer was capable of kind of developing that knowledge on its own and then applying it to other fields besides chess. But it was nonetheless an important threshold. And I think it just got people kind of interested again in the general public with this idea of AI. So it was a momentous turning point in the story.
It was a great media story. I was looking at the old film of Kasparov with his head in his hands. I mean, Kasparov had his head in his hands a lot of the time, when he was playing humans, never mind computers. Yeah. But in that game in 1997, he didn't win. It was a 6-game series. Deep Blue won 2 games. It drew 3. Kasparov didn't win a single game. He'd drawn with Deep Blue the previous year. It was a threshold moment. And as you say, I remember growing up and just thinking, chess, you had to learn chess because it would show you were clever and it would impress girls. And chess and intelligence have always been maybe too overlapped. But yeah, I think it's because it was chess and because it was so well publicized.
Yeah. And he was a very interesting guy. And as you said, it was, I think in that moment where you see him with his head in his hands, there's a sense of like, I have failed humanity, like up until this point, like humans were the best at this game. And now it's no longer the case. And now it's not even close. Very quickly after that, it became possible to play a Kasparov level game, with just a like home computer. So it turned out to be kind of an easier problem to solve than maybe Turing envisioned, but it was a milestone.
Can you remember this moment, Sarah? Can you remember Kasparov's head in his hands?
Yeah, absolutely. David and I are exactly the same age, so we tend to have the same level of vagary in our memories of big cultural moments like that. I totally remember that. But also, by the time that happened, I was in grad school and I was working with professors who were teaching sci-fi, and I was learning how to teach sci-fi as literature at that point. And you mentioned sci-fi earlier, Stephen, how important it was. And I just wonder, as far as thinking about that media moment, yeah, there's that bit of kind of, at first it sounds like a kind of man bites dog story where we've had a reversal of expectation. The machine beats the chess master. But in another sense, it was that, like you said, he let down humanity. Like we'd been expecting that all along because science fiction had primed us to see that this moment was coming, because we'd seen, as you say, the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's, iconic film about a voyage to Jupiter and the computer HAL 9000 that, becomes sentient and doesn't want to die and is this great exploration of artificial intelligence and of humanity's place in the universe, small questions like that. We've been waiting for HAL to tell us that it was taking over since then. And we've been waiting for the internet since William Gibson told us in Neuromancer what it was going to look like, right? And so I guess I just wonder to what extent was that sense of that step change, of that transformative moment, how much of that had actually also been primed by, I'm predisposed to think storytelling shapes how we think, how we see things. It seems to me that was an important part of people reacting the way that they did.
I'm so glad you're bringing this up, Sarah, because it's such an important point. I think people don't quite understand enough about the role that speculative fiction like this plays, in a sense, because, you have technologies and then you have the way that the culture embraces, responds to, or reacts to unanticipated consequences of that technology. This is a big theme of this show, right? Like how, here's something happens and then all these surprising things happened after that. And what sci-fi gives us is practice, anticipating what's coming and speculating. If we did in some dramatic cases too, like the Dune series, which I have not read, by the way.
I have, because I was a geeky teenager.
Yeah, there you go. But the idea that like kind of thinking machines are banned in that world because they're just too dangerous. That's an interesting scenario to imagine in your head. Like, could you imagine getting to a place like that? What you get as a society when you read sci-fi and when you write sci-fi is, kind of you're building scenarios for the future and imagining how things might play out so that when you do get to that future, you have some experience with that in a sense, even if it's fictional. Like that matters, and it shapes how you interpret the thing when it actually does arrive. So it's a really important part of the story.
And I also think, the people have talked about, for example, and I'm going to go back to 2001 just because it's such a familiar example, right? And scenes in that where Kubrick, he basically invents the iPad visually, right? There are astronauts floating around holding something that looks like an iPad. And people have pointed out since then that, on the one hand, you might say, oh, Kubrick, predicted the iPad. Or is it the case that it was such an influential textual work that when they came to invent the iPad, they made it look like the thing that was in 2001, right?
Yeah.
And that to a certain extent, what we're doing is fulfilling the expectations that have been created. And that's kind of what I was getting at when I asked that first question about intelligence as well. To what extent are we fulfilling the paradigms that we expect to see? And to what extent are we actually building something new, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. That you get these visions imprinted on your head. I mean, thankfully, no one has built AI as that kind of ominous red camera that is HAL in 9000, HAL 9000 in 2001.
Singing sad songs as he gets unplugged.
No, that's what I was going to bring up, actually. That actually is another place where this is kind of the bridge, in a way, from the winter to the last kind of 15 years where suddenly we emerged from the winter and we're now in whatever this is, the summer of AI? I don't know. Because what happens in that famous scene where they unplug HAL is that he basically kind of regresses back to his early training. And whatever it is, gets, it says, Dave, I'm starting to lose my mind. And he goes back, he starts singing nursery songs. And that is both based somewhat on what Turing had predicted. Like Turing had predicted you would start with a very rudimentary form of intelligence and you would kind of teach it about the world slowly over time. But it also anticipated what became the real revolution, which is kind of machine learning, deep learning, neural nets, this idea of training. So the paradigm shift that ends up happening, really starting around 2010, 2011, 2012, is that this approach of starting with a machine that's very stupid, that doesn't understand, like if its task is to identify photos and, identify this is a cat and this is a chair and this is an elephant, it begins incredibly bad at that task. But through this process that, is called training or reinforcement learning, basically it begins by kind of randomly guessing the identity of the objects in photos. In the first kind of run of it, it's terrible. But every now and then it gets kind of lucky. And it actually does guess cat when there's something close to a cat in the photo. And so whatever has gone into its thinking for that particular answer is basically amplified and reinforced. And then you go back and you do it again. And wherever it's, close to the right answer, you reinforce that particular configuration and you do that more. And then you go back. It's kind of an evolutionary process, basically. And so you can start with kind of zero understanding. And if you have enough iterations, and this is the key thing, if you have enough runs of this process, you can start to build up something that looks like knowledge or expertise in whatever you're training towards. And the reason why this idea had been around, in a way it's there in Turing in some sense, the reason why this hadn't worked before is you just couldn't get enough data and enough cycles to get to a good outcome. So, you couldn't just do this in 100 cycles. That wouldn't get you to anything resembling intelligence. You needed 1 million cycles. You needed 1 billion cycles. You just had to be able to run that evolutionary kind of algorithm for that long. And interestingly, again, games comes up in this because the thing that made this possible in many ways was the invention of something called a GPU, which is a specific kind of chip that is very good at these kinds of operations. And it's just way more efficient. So you can actually do those 1 million cycle runs with this chip at and it can be affordable.
And GPUs were invented to make computer games. Is that right?
They're invented for video games. They technically are really good at creating great graphics so that you can play Grand Theft Auto at high resolution. But it turns out that the math that they do is also really good for doing things like neural nets and reinforcement learning. And so once again, games are driving this field forward in a really surprising way.
So totally accidentally, a piece of technology, a general processing unit invented to make computer games better, to make loads of money as the computer game industry just takes off and gets bigger than the music industry and the film industry. It has this secondary function that it wasn't designed for, which it allows for this incredibly fast analysis of data.
Then that sets off an incredible series of really kind of research-based and game-based kind of breakthroughs starting about 10 years ago, led in part by DeepMind, and Demis Hassabis recently awarded a Nobel Prize, and in fact now employed by Google, now really the second most important person in Google. And at DeepMind, they developed these game-playing AIs, a chess one, but then most famously a Go playing one, because Go is actually a much more complicated game in a way. It's a harder problem to solve.
Go's more difficult than chess. We'd already had Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov. Go's a more complicated game, so a bigger challenge for the AI.
And what DeepMind did that was so revolutionary with this software called AlphaZero is basically they said, we're not going to give you, we're not even going to give you the rules of chess. They said, we're barely going to give you the rules of Go. And we're not going to give you any cheat sheet from the history of human Go players. What we're going to do is we're going to just give you the most basic understanding of how the game works. And we're going to have you play against yourself, the computer playing against a kind of a mirror image of the computer. And each time one of the two algorithms wins, the algorithm learns a little bit from the strategy that it happened to use. And so what you start off with is two incredibly bad Go players playing against each other. And they just played for 36 hours. They played, millions of games against each other over that 36-hour period. And by the end of it, just through this process of learning from each game, AlphaZero was the greatest Go player in the world, entirely self-taught. And there's a very famous game where then AlphaZero played against the human world Go champion Lee Sedol, and it wins. And there's a very famous move that it makes at a certain point in the game, which is seen as this milestone again in the history of AI, where everybody sees AlphaZero make this move, and they all say, "Oh, this is such a stupid move. It's made a terrible mistake." And then somehow they realize that it's absolutely brilliant, and it's a move no one had ever made before in the history of Go. Do not ask me to explain this move because I'm not a Go player, but experts tell me that it was an incredibly brilliant kind of breakthrough idea. It seemed very creative if you knew the history of Go, and so this kind of proved in a way that really reverberated through the field that you could do this kind of bottom-up learning. You didn't have to teach the model all these human strategies. It could learn on its own. And once you had a machine capable of learning on its own, that initial prophecy from Turing, so many years before was finally beginning to be fulfilled.
Let's take a break there. And then when we come back, let's talk about how we got to today, how AI made the leap into what's called the large language models of the 21st century. Welcome back to Journey Through Time. We're here speaking with Stephen Johnson about the strange and surprisingly long history of artificial intelligence. Stephen, the world that we're in now, the world of large language models that seems to have suddenly kind of taken over our world, that's based on an idea called deep learning. Is that right?
Yeah. And this is where we get really back to the world of language that we talked about at the beginning, where so much of our understanding of intelligence is bound up in our use of language. And up until about 5 years ago, machines were really incapable of generating convincing prose on their own. They could be instructed in software to kind of, there are people, played with video games and things like that where, there's a text-based adventure that you're playing and there's lots of words on the screen, but all that stuff has been scripted in a sense in advance.
And algorithms trigger what the computer thinks are the correct response.
Yeah, it's like there's a menu of possible things to say. And the algorithm is like, if the character does this, then say this. If the character does this, then say that. So people have been kind of talking with their computers in a way that seemed kind of convincing for a while. But all that stuff, even things like Siri, on Apple devices. All the things that Siri was saying were in a sense kind of scripted. And there was an initial breakthrough actually with deep learning where the computer started to be good at translating. You didn't have to teach it the rules of French and the rules of English. It could kind of learn those rules independently, just as AlphaZero learned the rules of Go independently. But starting around 2020, we began to see the rise of these things called large language models. And what's amazing about language models is that the core thing that they do, where they get their intelligence, is predicting words in a sentence. So this is how they're trained. Basically, they're given a whole host of like documents. In the case of these big models, a huge amount of information from the internet and other sources. And then they're given words, they're given sentences where a word is missing. And they're asked to predict the next token, it's called, but it's just basically a word, the next word in the sentence. And just like with AlphaZero, initially they're terrible at it. And they kind of you give it a sequence and you say like, one of the early pioneers of AI was Alan blank, predict the next word. And in the early training runs, it says Rosenblatt and cow and cloud and a million other wrong answers. But way down on the list, it says maybe it's Turing. And so whatever kind of configuration has led to that guess, you reinforce, you amplify that, you kind of increase what they call the weights associated with that response. And then you run it again with a different set of sentences. And you do that just a seemingly infinite number of times. And what we started to see around 2020, 2021 is if you did that, computers actually seemed to be able to learn at least like syntax really well, so that they could actually have a kind of somewhat fluid conversation, even if it was filled with like factual inaccuracies and could seem it was a little bit like talking to somebody who was on some heavy medication and was like hallucinating some of the time, but clearly had some command of the English language, but they weren't very reliable. But you're kind of like, well,
that sounds like teaching 19-year-olds to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's not unfamiliar, but nothing had ever been like that before. And for me, I got first kind of mesmerized by the possibilities here in the fall of 2021. So there is a company now famous, at that point much more obscure, called OpenAI. And they had developed this language model that was called GPT-3. So this is a full year before ChatGPT. And I'd heard about it, but it wasn't publicly available. But I was interested in this company. They had a strange, like, for-profit, non-profit structure, and there were some interesting figures involved. This guy, Sam Altman, and this guy, Elon Musk, and all this stuff. And so I'd actually, I'd gone to the New York Times Magazine, and I'd said, hey, I want to write a story about OpenAI. I don't really want to write a story about their language models, because other people have written about that. I want to write about the people and the organizational structure of this company, because I don't think people know that much about it. But as part of that story, I got access to GPT-3. And I remember sitting at this, where I'm sitting right now, in like October of 2021, getting access to this thing just to test it out, and just sitting there for 2 hours having this conversation with an artificial intelligence, an open-ended conversation where I was telling it to do things, it would respond. And I just remember thinking, this is going to change everything.
And you started writing about GPT-3, about AI, that fall into the early part of 2022. I was reading the article you wrote for the New York Times, and it's in the future tense, but it is exactly what we are discussing now. It's like sort of 8 months later. Everything that you're writing about speculatively was exactly what we were writing about for real, because ChatGPT came out in the November of that year. You're sort of 10 months ahead, and able to talk in the future tense about where we are right now.
The other funny thing about it, David, is that it was the most controversial article I've ever written in my life. And I'm very proud of that piece. But it did lead to this interesting development. It really kind of led directly to NotebookLM, the product that I've created with Google, because there were people inside of Google who read the article, who had been reading my work over the years. And I'd always been interested in using technology, using software to help me with the writing and the research process and thinking about history, right? I mean, you both know what it's like to try and write a work of history where you have, potentially thousands of sources. You have information scattered across all these different documents. You can't keep it all in your head at any given moment in time. And so I'd always thought, how can I use the tools of the computer age to help me manage all that information and maybe even start to see connections that maybe I wouldn't have seen on my own. I've kind of been interested in that idea for a long time. And so they came to me, the folks at Google came to me and said, hey, with these language models, you've been chasing this kind of dream of the ideal research assistant tool your entire life, really, like literally back to when I was in college in the late 80s. And they said, why don't you come to Google, and we've got a small team and we can try to build something using language models as the core technology for it all. And because I'm not an idiot, I said, that sounds like a great idea. And that ultimately led to this product, Notebook LM, that is now being used by people all around the world.
That phrase, that title, Notebook, I mean, you have a huge physical library of every thought that's going to pass your mind since you were an undergraduate.
Yeah, well, actually, it's a digital library. I mean, I kept it deliberately on the computer and not in physical notebooks because I knew at least it would be searchable if I had a digital copy of it. What I didn't realize is that I can now I have a collection of like 8,000 quotes from books that I've read over the last 20 years that I've just been keeping on my computer, in a sense, waiting for this moment. And now I can take that. That is the whole history of like the ideas from other people's minds that have shaped like who I am intellectually. And I can now take all of those quotes and put them into a single notebook inside a Notebook LM. And at that moment, it's as if the AI has read all the important things that are essential to me and that make up my worldview. And its memory of all those things is much better than mine is, right? I can't remember 8,000 quotes. And so I'm constantly going back to Notebook and saying, hey, I'm writing something here about the gold rush in California. And I'm interested particularly in, the kind of material science of gold and how the chemistry of gold kind of like, developed. Is there anything in my reading history that's relevant to that? And it's able to make these associations. It's able to kind of sum it up, this article talked about it here that you read, 15 years ago. And this is kind of relevant because it's about the history of California and the Sierra Nevada mountains. And this might be relevant because of this. And so it's like there's this extension of my own mind that is very much customized to the problems and the obsessions that I personally have had as a writer and as a historian over the years.
When you described giving your research to the Notebook software, you said you give it what's important and what's essential. I'm not trying to press you on the words that you were casually using to tell this, but I think they're indicative and they relate to they lead directly to the question that I want to ask, because the Turing limit, if that's the right word, this question of whether it could do analogical thinking, right? And now we know that it can, as you say. And what you described it doing is pattern recognition, right? It can recognize the pattern when you say, I'm looking for things that look like this, and it can find those patterns, right? But you're the one deciding what's important and what's essential. So that is a question of judgment, right? Of values, of deciding what matters and what doesn't matter, of thinking about consequences, of being able to sift priorities, right? And my question really is, are we at another Turing limit where, am I right in thinking that judgment is one of the things that it still categorically cannot do? Because you described the Brian Eno and the dolphin thing as a creative problem, but it's also a problem that involves certain kinds of judgments.
Yeah, it's a great question, Sarah. So I think we are at that limit. I actually think we will probably get past it, but you're defining exactly where we are. And let me give you a specific example. So I use AI and notebooks specifically all the time, in a lot of different ways where it clearly just works and is very reliable. So I'll use it to remember something. What was the deal with that thing that one person said? I'll use it to organize the information, like take all this stuff and turn it into a timeline of events. You know how important that is for historians to just get the chronology right. Like things that would take 10 hours to do, like Notebook will do in 10 seconds. Just like, here's the timeline of all the events scattered through these 45 documents that you've given me. And I'll use it to kind of brainstorm. Like I'll be like, okay, if we structured the chapter this way, like suggest a couple of different ways to structure it, like specifically, like what would be the beats in this particular moment. And it's quite good at generating possibilities. But where it's tricky right now is you say, hey, here's the first draft. What do you think? Is it good or not? Right? And it's a little bit like the Turing test. It's a little bit like Eliza, actually, in the sense that like when you first read its response, you're impressed. And also you're flattered because in general, the models are kind of tuned to be supportive. And so the first time you try this, it'll be like, oh, yes, Stephen, like this is very sophisticated work.
You're a genius.
I particularly appreciated the subtle way in which you brought, it will pick up like good things about what you've done. But we spent a lot of time like trying to figure out like, how can we get it to do more constructive criticism? And we have a feature at Notebook LM that's kind of our most famous feature called audio overviews that will take your sources and actually turn it into a podcast-like format. So it sounds like two people in conversation with each other. You may be familiar with this format. I don't know. And they
never listened to them myself.
Yeah, exactly.
These AI hosts are very supportive. And so if you give them your short story, say, hey, do a podcast about this short story, they'll be like, oh, this is a thrilling story, whatever. And so you can give them instructions. And so I've been playing around with trying to get them to be critical, like in a productive way. And my favorite example of this is I gave them an essay that I'd written for the New York Times Magazine, not the AI one, another one. And I said, I want you to be really critical and, really give me some tough love here. And I have my friends know that I have this longstanding obsession with Harari, the guy who wrote Sapiens and all those other books, who has written in kind of a similar genre to me, except that he's sold 1 billion copies of his books versus like my meager amount. So I find him very like irritating just between friends. And so I generate this podcast of like, be critical about my work. And the first thing they say is like, oh, this Stephen Johnson article. I mean, who does he think he is? Like Harari? No way. He's like a 2-bit, like, pretending to be Harari kind of also ran. And I was like, oh man, you guys got me really deep there. That was pretty brutal. So I think that, we have to, there's a lot of experiments going on here. And I do think it's possible, just as they can learn the things that I'm interested in and the facts that I'm interested in and the patterns that I'm trying to see. I think it's an open question, but I think it is possible that you could also teach them a certain kind of judgment. But you would have to, in a sense, instruct them. There's no universal judgment here. Like it's going to be like your particular view of the world or someone else's particular view of the world. But I think that's right. As you say, like that's the limit we're at right now.
All three of us write history books, Stephen. And I mean, the big question really has got to be is, as historians, the self-interested question is, how is it going to change that process? Well, what are the potential benefits, but what are also the risks of having an amazing tool like Notebook LM to how people think about books that appear in the world?
I think the optimistic version of this, which is what I'm trying to do. Look, I think that these tools are going to be, they already are really useful for what we do in terms of creating the books. I think the interesting question is, how do they change the way that people consume them? And so one of the things that I'm actively working on right now that we're doing some really exciting experiments with, and we'll have more information about this like over the next couple of months, is thinking about what happens if you, in a sense, publish a book as a notebook. And so you publish the entire text of the book. You can read it in the notebook. You can read it start to finish, just the way you like. But you also could maybe include in the notebook your secondary, maybe the primary sources that you used, all the public domain information that was relevant to the book. So that's also part of the notebook as well. And then people can read the book, but then they can also ask questions. Or they can say, hey, I'm a 10th grader. I'm having a little bit of difficulty understanding this particular section. Can you explain it to me in a language that's maybe more suited for my background? Or I want to like listen to a discussion of this book while I'm driving to work today. So generate a podcast that describes this book. Or I want to combine this book, and this book and actually see the commonalities between them. I want help understanding them and the patterns that are there. And so in a sense, you would read books with the AI, with Notebook as an assistant, helping you through the material. And I think that there's a lot, if people are genuinely trying to understand history and how it works and understand this material, like it's fantastic. The risk, obviously, as we've talked about, as folks have talked about endlessly, is somehow using the AI as a way of avoiding the understanding process, but creating the illusion of understanding something. So that's the classic, like, I'm going to get this work of history and I'm going to press, generate essay to ChatGPT or Notebook, and it will generate the essay and I'll hand it and I'll get an A, and I will have never read the book and I will have no understanding in my own brain. And so the way I kind of come back to it is like for folks like us who are trying to explain history to people and to convey our understanding of history to other minds. If folks are interested in actually having that understanding themselves, AI is a fantastic tool. It will help you get to that understanding faster and will give you a deeper understanding. I'm convinced of that. If you are trying to create the illusion of understanding something, AI will also help you with that. And that is the challenge. Like particularly in an educational context, like how do we ensure that it's the former and not the latter? Once you leave school, the reward for pretending to understand something gets less useful. Like when you're in school, you just want that A and you don't necessarily care sometimes. But once you enter the workforce or you have your own passions or you want to do something in the world, you actually need to have understanding. And so the strategy of kind of bluffing your way through it doesn't really pay off in the end. But school is a very unique kind of configuration of things that is a little bit more challenging.
But also, isn't it the case that, you and I, the three of us are all of a generation broadly. We have a meta understanding. We have an understanding of understanding because we learned through that deep reading that you're talking about. And so I understand the way you're talking about using this as a prosthetic tool, but for a kind of approach to understanding that I already have and to the kind of knowledge that you're talking about that comes from, you've already decided what the important books are in the essential reading because you've already done an enormous amount of reading on your own and taken that in. But of course, we get very quickly to a point where, and I'm already starting to see it with my students, where their understanding of understanding is getting affected by this. And they believe that they understand a topic when they have a very, very superficial grasp of it. And they have been rewarded for having a very, very superficial grasp of it, or often an inaccurate version of it. And yet they are under the impression that they understand it. Now, this, to me, has a massive consequences, not least because I would put to you a couple of pretty prominent examples of people in leadership position in yours and my country, Stephen, who have a limited understanding of the things that they think that they understand. Right? This is really, really important. And so I actually think there are many more risks than just that one. And one of them is the way that it interferes with people's acquisition of knowledge and understanding, and the way that as teachers, we can push them and press them, encourage them to stretch themselves like the coaches that we actually are. You use the example, the Chomsky example of saying, great, you used a bulldozer to win the Olympics. It's like saying, if you're an athletic coach, to say to a weightlifter, you can use the pneumatic machine to lift weights, but you have not actually built up your strength. You are not any fitter. You're not any better. You lifted the weights, but so what? To what purpose? Right? And we're coaches if we're teachers. And to me, that's the issue here is that it starts to come in and do that lifting for you. And then your muscle isn't doing the stretching that it needs to do in order to improve.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So I was just working on a document for Notebook for kind of our roadmap for the next 6 months that gets to this question entirely, which is like, we're very interested in having the AI in Notebook be another kind of coach for you, right? And so you should be able to go into Notebook and say like, hey, I'm trying to learn this thing. Help me understand it. And for that to work, and this is what I was writing, the AI has to have a mental model of where your level of comprehension is. This is what obviously like what we do as teachers is we try and intuit and gauge and measure like where our students are in their journey of understanding. And then teach to that limit, right? We're like, okay, now you've gotten this far. Now I'm going to teach you the next thing so that you can understand that. We're going to build a scaffolding up to a higher level of understanding. If you don't know where the student is, in that journey, you can't teach. You can't, you're just going to kind of like throw out random facts and you're not going to actually progress. And so one of the things that we're trying to design, this is kind of cutting edge stuff here now, is that in a sense, as you converse and engage with the AI in Notebook LM, it's actually creating a kind of story about what you're thinking and where your flaws are in your thinking, where your blind spots are, the things you don't yet understand, where you seem to be bluffing it. And it should be able over time to then say, okay, look, Stephen, I think you actually have a very superficial knowledge of this particular part of the problem that you're trying to master here. And so I think we should spend a bunch of time just going through this. I can walk you through how it works and then I can evaluate like your understanding as it develops. And if everyone like with access to a computer and internet has a personalized kind of coach that can work in that way and really like take you through your learning journey that way, like I think there's a lot of possibility there for advancement in true understanding the world. But we'd have to be able to have the AI have that mental model of where you are in terms of your understanding.
Can we take a step back to the bigger picture of AI and how rapidly this technology has gone from something that was in science fiction books to something which is just absolutely part of our lives. That moment you had, Stephen, with GPT-3, when this stuff it's here. If we compare the arrival of AI to the arrival of other technologies, what's distinct about it and what feels like we've seen this pattern before?
I mean, that's one of the great questions of this particular moment. There's a lot of interesting debate. There was just a very interesting essay published a month or two ago called AI as Normal Technology. And they were basically making the argument that whenever technology is introduced, it can do new things, but its adoption is naturally kind of slowed down by cultural resistance and just the sluggishness of workplaces and the culture at large to adopt new technologies. And so there are kind of breaks that are put, even though technically it's possible to do X isn't done at scale for a decade or 2 decades because it just takes a while for technologies to diffuse through society. The flip side of it that the kind of accelerationists would argue is that ChatGPT went from 0 users in the fall of 2022 to almost 1 billion users 3 years later. And no piece of software has ever been that quickly adopted by that many people. And so you look at that trajectory and you think, well, maybe this time it's different, right? That's the question.
It could be that the innovation period was the 70 years from Turing in the 1950s up until 2022.
That's a great way to think about it.
And we already have been through that period. We just didn't notice it.
Yeah, no, I think that may be consistent with history. It's just we have to measure the starting point at a different point. But there are a couple of other big questions that we just don't have the answers to. So we've been on a crazy exponential curve in the last 4 years, basically, with the language models. And what we don't know is that curve going to basically level out? And are we just going to kind of hit the limits of this? And the models will get quite good at human-like analysis and they'll be good at building timelines. Maybe they'll develop some judgment, but they're not going to be superhuman in their intellectual abilities. And they aren't going to take a lot of jobs. You're not going to just hire a bunch of AIs to replace all the lawyers in your law firm because they're not reliable enough or they're not smart enough to do that or they're missing some human element that's really important. We don't know the answer to that. The one thing that is interesting here is compared to earlier technological revolutions is that generally the earlier technological revolutions, particularly in the last 200 years, created a whole host of jobs for knowledge workers that, had not existed before. So you didn't have, anywhere near the number of lawyers that you do now before the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution created all these giant corporations that needed all these kind of legal experts to build their documents and to sue other corporations and to work with the government and all these different things. And so you created all these very valuable forms of knowledge work that became like some of the most valuable jobs in the world. And in the world of AI, for the first time, like the jobs that are actually like being threatened by AI right now are specifically the knowledge workers, the programmers and the lawyers, and not the plumbers. And so there is a potential inversion of historical patterns where actually the most threatened jobs are the ones that are actually at the top of the chain and the most valuable ones, and how society and people in those very powerful roles react to that is, I think, a known unknown as well.
But it's also important that we say, right, that the high value, as you say, of knowledge workers that is being replaced by AI, the AI is also built on stealing that high value knowledge work from those knowledge workers globally. And everybody knows this. Everybody knows that this is all based on scraping all of the books that the three of us have written and everybody else's books in order to do this. So it isn't just a case that, a new technology is coming that might replace us. It's that it's already stolen from us in order to mimic what we do to replace us, to enrich a handful of people and to make sure that the rest of our knowledge work is made less valuable as a result. And that is a more complicated situation, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, I think there are two things that I think the folks are working on actively to try and get right, which is to the extent that information is put into that initial training data for these models, which is that process where they learn to predict the next word based on training data. We should ensure as a society that the rights holders for that training data are being properly compensated for if their material is in there.
we should, but we aren't.
Well, I would disagree with that. I think that there's a huge number. I mean, I'm in the middle of a bunch of different conversations with the big publishers about how their information is brought into. There are a whole host of like conversations happening now and deals being struck now where people are being compensated for training data. There are cases where we have seen where it seems like some of that rights protected information was in the training data for some models. I won't say who they are. But in general, it's important that we get that part of the equation right as well. But I also think this is why I'm really interested in this idea of like, can we use AI as a new way to distribute the stuff that the three of us create? To me, there's a new opportunity here, just as ebooks, just as audiobooks became. I mean, audiobooks are a huge part of the money we make from books now, that just didn't exist 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so I think kind of AI-powered versions of the things that we write, and the kind of embodied knowledge that the three of us have collected over the years, being able to package that in a new way and sell it to people and create new revenue streams for us. I think that's actually a really interesting part of this whole conversation that we haven't even started to explore. So the point, I think, is that it's not inevitable that this is a net negative for people who have expertise in the world that is valuable, that they want to potentially sell to other people. I think we just have to do the work of getting it right and making sure that the folks who create that information are represented at the table. And that's a huge part of what I've been trying to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why Google wanted to have an author who spent his career creating information and sharing that information and selling that information to be involved with this project at the beginning.
Stephen, it's been fascinating to talk with you. I've learned loads. I've learned, in particular, never ask AI to genuinely be critical, because it sounds like it really goes for it.
Yeah, it might hurt your feelings. Yeah,
it's nasty. It's nasty.
I won't make that mistake. And thank you for listening to Journey Through Time. We'll be back, Sarah and myself, very soon for another episode. See you then.
Thanks. See you then.